Hello. Today we'll be focusing on how to add and subtract numbers in scientific notation. Go ahead and fill in your table of contents, adding and subtracting in scientific notation. You'll notice I'm on page 57 to 58. We're still in Unit 3. Our goal for today is to be able to add and subtract numbers in scientific notation. And our essential question is, how do I use numbers expressed in scientific notation to add and subtract? Feel free to pause the video and write all this down. All right. So when we are adding and subtracting, there are two things we need to make sure of. And one of those is the power. If it's to the same power, 10 to the 9th, 10 to the 9th, you add or subtract the values that are in scientific notation. Okay? And then you make sure you keep that. Keep the power of 10. So you add or subtract those front numbers and then keep the power of 10. Remember to make sure that your final answer is in scientific notation. If we have different powers of 10, because of the place value, if the numbers in scientific notation do not have the same power of 10, you can choose to rewrite the numbers so that way they have the same power of 10, or you can convert the numbers to standard notation, add or subtract, and then rewrite them back into scientific notation, whichever is easiest to you. Today I will recommend a calculator as we work through these problems. All right, so let's look at an example. So the first thing we look at is our power of 10. It's the same. They're both 10 to the 8th power. So all I have to do is add my numbers out front. So I'm going to add 6 and 2/10 and 2 and 3/10. And feel free, if you need to use a calculator or otherwise add them. So when we add those, you should end up with 8 and 5/10. And then all we do is we keep the power. So times 10 to the 8th. So this would simplify 8 and 5/10 times 10 to the 8th. Okay, so here, again, I check my powers of 10. I've got 10 to the -3rd, 10 to the -3rd, right? So they're the same, so all I have to do is now subtract these numbers. Think of them as kind of like coefficients. Remember, we always multiplied or divided our coefficients first? Do the same here. So I have 9 minus 4, which is 5, and then I'm going to keep that power, times 10 to the -3rd. Always when you're done, make sure that the answer is still in scientific notation. So 5 is between 1 and 10, so I'm good. Okay, so here, now, I'm going to check and notice they are different powers. So you could do this one of two ways, or even three ways. You could use your calculator, type this whole thing in the calculator exactly how you see it with parentheses. You can change both numbers to standard form and add them, or you can change them both so that way they're in the same scientific notation and then add them. So here, what I'm going to do is I tend to always change, and I'll show you an example of each, the one that has the smaller power of 10. So in this case, it's 10 to the 6th. So I usually always change that because it just tends to help me in the end. So when I do that, I have to move the decimal place so that way I would increase the exponent. So I'm not doing anything with the first one. And then I'm going to change the second one so that way I end up with the same power of 10. So because I moved the decimal to the left, I would add 1 to the exponent. And now I can go ahead and add them. So I would add those numbers out front. So I have 4 and 7/10 plus 0 and 3/4. And again, you can, if you need to use a calculator, please feel free. And we should end up with 5 and 4/100. Okay, then we keep our power of 10. So that would be times 10 to the 7th. Okay, let's look at another example. Okay, here, so notice again, I see that I have different powers of 10. So if I'm looking here, I've got 10 to the 5th, 10 to the 4th. So let's do it the other way. Let's convert it all to standard form. So this would be 9, and I need 5 zeros because my decimal would be here. Minus, and this would become 8, and then I would need 4 zeros because my decimal would be here as well. And then I can subtract. So this would be 9,000 minus 80,000. Or, I'm sorry, 900,000 minus 80,000. And if we type that into our calculator, we should get 820,000. Okay, so now we need to make sure our final answer is written in scientific notation. So now I'm going to go backwards and change this back to scientific notation. So I would get 8 2/10 times 10. And then let's see here. I gotta count these place values. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so there's a couple ways you can do that. All right, so I need to check my powers of 10. And the last way you could do it is to actually type all of it into your calculator. Now, we need to know the other ways because you may not always be able to use a calculator. But if you do have the option, you can type it in exactly how you see it. So that would be parentheses 2 8/10 times 10. And then you would set it to the power of -5 and close that parentheses. If you don't know how to type in this exponent in your calculator, that's something you could YouTube. But if you're listening carefully, right above the x squared in your calculator button, there's like this little arrow looking thing. You would hit that and then type in -5. Okay, and then we would do plus parentheses 5.4 times 10. Again, you're going to raise that to the -6, and then you would close the parentheses. So you have to type it in exactly with that. Sometimes it's not always going to have the parentheses, but you need to make sure you have them. And then you would just hit equals. And then if you did that exactly how I said, you should end up with a number that looks like this. Now, if the number is too great or too small for the calculator, it'll automatically put it into scientific notation for you. And that's something you're going to need to be able to recognize, because there's been a lot of times you'll get that and we might not even be in scientific unit. And I have kids come up to me that are like, what does this mean? Well, it just means scientific notation. You have to know if you can write it that way or change it. And you'll be using scientific notation a lot in science class. And then our last step here is to just rewrite it back into scientific notation. So that means my decimal point needs to go between the threes. So I have 3 and 34 hundredths. I'm going to lose that 0 there. And then times 10. And I need to count these place values. So here I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Remember, this is a small number, so it's going to be to the -5th. Okay, so that's all 3 ways you could do that. All right, let's take a look at this problem. So here, I have different exponents. Again, I'm going to go back to that first way I showed you. So I like to always make sure it's with the larger exponent. And you'll notice that -3 is actually greater than -4. So I'm going to move it to where I'm going to move that the other direction. So that means I'm going to move this decimal place to the left. So anytime we're increasing our exponent, I want to move it to the left. So I'm not doing anything with the first one here. So 7 2/10 times 10 to the -3 minus, and over here I'm now going to have 0 68 hundredths times 10 to the -3, because we add 1. Okay. You'll notice I always move it to the left and increase the smaller power, because that's going to give me an easier number here to work with. If I had moved it to the right and decreased, that's going to give me a 2-digit number, and then I've got to work to put it back into scientific notation later. So if you recognize that we are moving it to where we want to keep a smaller number right here, that'll make it a little bit easier for you. All right, so we subtract those numbers. So I've got 7 2/10 minus 0 68 hundredths. Again, it's perfectly acceptable to type it into your calculator. I do a lot of times too, just to make sure I'm not making any mistakes. Okay, and once you've done that, you should get 6 52 hundredths. And then we're going to keep that new power of 10 that we created. So hopefully at this point you are getting used to this. All right, so now we have a different type of problem. Again, you could type this in your calculator exactly how you see it and then convert it back to scientific notation later. Or you can change the one in scientific notation to standard form. Or you could change the one in standard form to scientific notation. The only thing about that is I would always make sure that I would end up with the same power. If I'm not going to end up with the same power, that's not the way I want to go. So I would always look, okay, what's my place value here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right, perfect. So I'm probably going to go that method. So this would give me 3 2/10 times 10 to the 5th. And then I'm going to bring everything else down. And we are adding. So I'm going to add those two front numbers. So 6 and 4/10 plus 3 and 2/10. So that's going to give me 9 and 6/10. And then keep my power. So here is your final answer in scientific notation. Make sure you do read directions. Today we're focusing on writing all of our answers in scientific notations. Sometimes the directions may want you to write your final answer in standard form. It's always important to read the directions so you are making sure you're solving it correctly. Okay, so here's another one. So here I'm going to take a look. All right, I have a 10 to the negative 4. So if I moved this decimal, would it be in 10 to the negative 4? Yes, it would. So I'm going to go ahead and rewrite it. And I noticed that because here's my 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, and then I'm subtracting. So now I'm going to subtract 5 and 4/10 minus 3 and 2/10. So that's going to give me 2 and 2/10 times 10 to the negative 4. All right, at this time, I would like for you to try these 4 problems. Okay, so I know this might be a little bit confusing to see, but here are the 4 problems. Go ahead and pause the video and see if you can solve these 4. Okay, hopefully at this time you've paused the video and you've worked these 4 problems out, so let's see how you did. No matter which method you took, you should end up with the same final answer. So number 1 should have been 7 and 9/10 times 10 to the 9th. Number 2 should have been 6 and 2/10 times 10 to the negative 3. Those two already had them at the same exponent. The next two you had to change or type it all in your calculator the way you see it, and then convert it back, either or. And you should have ended up with 4 and 19/100 times 10 to the 6, and 8 and 82/100 times 10 to the 3rd. Okay, if you still have any questions after this, please make sure you get them answered. At this time, you are ready to move on to today's assignment.